Alright, so let's continue with where we left off. In this part B of episode 7, we're going to update headlines to fetch real-world news data and also make it a bit more interactive by adding a state object. If you're new here, we did part A of this episode in the previous video, and the link is in the description. So let's jot down the changes that we're going to do in this video. We'll start with adding a state object to headlines. This will help us in persisting state across restarts. We'll combine this with the confy and the serde crate to serialize the object in a config file. And doing so would allow us to save the preferences of user across restarts. With access to the state object, we can then implement toggling between the dark and light theme. By default, egui has dark mode enabled, but it also has a set of styles for switching to the light theme. We'll then create an API key config window to allow users to set the API key from within the app. The API key will also be persisted across restarts using confy. Finally, we'll wire up the news API crate to fetch news articles within the scroll area widget. With that being said, I'm going to go back to headlines.rs and let's start adding the state object. So I'm going to create a struct called headlines config, and to start with, we're going to add a field called dark mode, and this is going to represent the state for the theme of our app. If the value is true, the theme will use the dark mode, else it will use a white theme. So this is going to be a boolean. And if you remember the button that we added within the render top panel for switching the theme, this is the place where we'll be using the dark mode field to toggle between the two themes. And if you notice that we capture the result of calling the add function with a button as a theme button variable, and this is a response object, and using the response object we can add event handlers on any widget that has been added to egui. Now, our event handling strategy is very simple in this case. We just need to capture a click event on the button for us to be able to toggle the theme. So what we can do is we can type theme button.clicked, and this is going to return a boolean. So if the button is clicked, we're going to modify the dark mode to be the inverse of the previous value that we had. But if you see the error, we don't have access to dark mode here. So in order to have access to the dark mode field, we're going to need to add the config in the headlines instance, since render top panel is a method on headlines. So let's do that. I'm going to go back to headlines and I'm going to add in a field called config, and this is going to be headlines config. Now, since we have added this, let's update the new method where this gets initialized. I'm going to do config and let's call the new method. This method is not created, so I'm going to add in a new method for headlines config. Now, if you don't know, within impl block, we can use something called a self type alias to refer to the type that we are implementing the function for. And even for the initialization, we can use self as the type alias, and then we will keep dark mode as true by default. So with the new method added, let's go back to the render top panel function, and this time we will have to use self.config.darkmode, and also the same here. And the compiler says that it is behind an immutable reference. So the fix is simple. We're just going to type and mute to convert this into a mutable reference. And while we're still at the render top panel method, let's also add an event handler to the close button as well. So I'm going to attach an event handler. If the button is clicked, we're going to quit the app. Now the quit method is available on the frame instance. So I'm going to go back to main, and we'll also pass this frame object from the update method to render top panel as well. So I'm going to pass it here, and I'm going to update the params in render top panel. And let's update the quit method call to be part of the frame object. Let's do cargo run. Let's check if our theme button works, and looks like there is not much happening. How about the close button? That works. And the reason the theme switching does not work is that we're just changing the state here, but are not acting on the value of the state. So this can be done in the update method right before we render our widgets. So what we can do is we can access the config object here, and we'll check on the dark mode's value. And if it is true, we're going to use the context object to set the visuals to be of the dark theme. Else, we're going to set this to a light theme. And we're not able to access the config field because it is private. So let's make it public. Let's also make it public for the dark mode field. And let's also make this public. Cool. So with that change, we should be able to toggle between the dark and light theme. And if you click on the theme button, you can see that theme toggle works. Let's also change the icon depending on what theme is being set. So back in headlines, we can do a conditional expression here. We'll replace this static string with a conditional expression. And within this, I'm going to check if self.config.darkMode is enabled. We're going to use a sun emoji. Otherwise, it's going to be a moon. And let's try that again. And hey, we are able to change the icon as well based on the theme that we are in. Cool. So let's also make some changes when the app has a light theme, because if you take a look, we're not able to read the title properly as well as the hyperlink, which is barely readable. In order to change that, we're going to have to go back to the render news cards method. And for the title of the article, we're going to do the same conditional check. So we can do something like if self.config.darkMode will add the title as white, else we're going to add it as a black color. Now black isn't defined yet, so I'm going to define the black color with all the components as 0, and let's rename this to black. Let's also change the color of the hyperlink. So if it's a dark mode, we'll be rendering it as cyan, else let's render it as red. Let's define red, and we should see the new colors on the light theme. And hey, this is already looking a lot better now. So for the refresh button, we're going to add it later once we integrate the news API crate. Next, let's integrate the config crate so that we can save the app state in a file. So I'm going to go to the headlines subcrate, and I'm going to add confy, and I'm also going to add Serde. And let's expand the import to also include the derive feature. So for confy to serialize a Rust data structure, it needs an annotation of Serde's serialize and deserialize method. So let's do that. Let's import Serde serialize and deserialize. So then we can import the config object by using confy's load function, and we can give our config a name. I'm going to keep it headlines, and this returns a result because for the first time this will fail. So instead of unwrapping, what we can do is we can use a method called unwrap or default, and this needs a type annotation. So let's do that. Let's put headlines config here, and since we're using the unwrap or default method, this means that in case the loading of config file fails, this method will then try to call the default method implemented on the headlines config struct. But since we haven't implemented the default trait on headlines config, we're getting an error from the compiler. So let's implement the default trait. Let's do impl default for headlines config, and let's fill in the method. And it's amazing that for some of the situations, such as implementing defaults, the Rust analyzer is smart enough to auto-implement the methods for us. So in this case, a Boolean field already has the default method implemented, so it just delegates the call to its implementation of default. So with the default trait implemented, we should be able to load the config file even if there isn't a config file in the file system. Now confy uses the directories crate underneath, and in case of a Linux system, the configuration file will go to the .config folder and the name of the configuration file that we gave, which is headlines in this case. And it follows a similar convention for other operating systems as well. So with the config object being loaded from confy, we can then remove our previous initialization of headlines config and replace that with the one loaded from confy. And notice that we're using a shorthand syntax here for struct initialization, which means that if the field and the variable names are the same, you can simply type in the name and it will double up as an initializer. So we now have the app state being persisted using confy. Next, we'll add an API key config window to allow users to set the API key, which will then enable the app to load the news articles. But before we do that, let's set up a logger, as it'll be helpful down the road. Unlike printline debugging, which always requires one to recompile and rerun the program, using a logger has an advantage to turn application logs on or off with a flick of an environment variable. For the logger, we'll use two crates. The first is called tracing, and then tracing subscriber. Tracing provides logging APIs such as warn, error, or info as macros, whereas tracing subscriber is an implementation of the subscribe trait. The subscribe trait comes from the tracing trait and defines details such as how and where to output your logs. In this case, we're going to use the standard out subscriber, which is called FMT. So I'm going to initialize my subscriber in main.rs. So initializing our subscriber is simple. We can just do trace in subscriber, and we'll use the FMT module and then call init. Once this has been initialized, we can then use any one of the tracing APIs, for example, error, and can log anything on the screen. So we'll be using this in later parts of the video, and let's get back to creating the API config window. Under the impl block for headlines, I'm going to add a method called render config, and this method will take in a context object. So I'm going to pass that, and within the method, we'll then use a window widget, which is again a layout container, and use the new method to initialize this. We can give this a name. Let's call it configuration, and can then call the show method to render it on screen. We'll pass the context object from above, and for the second param, this is going to be the closure. And within the window, let's first add a label. Let's put a helpful message. So there's our label. Let's try to render this in the update method, and right before the render top panel method, we'll call render config and pass context object. And let's make this public. And let's try to run this and take a look at how things are looking. Nice. As you can see, we have a floating window being rendered on top of our app. And right now, this only contains a text label. We're going to expand this and add a text input field so that users can enter their API key and configure the API key within the app. So let's close that. Let's continue with render config. Let's add a text input label. This can be done by using the text edit single line widget. And as the text param, we need to pass a mutable reference to a string so that we can accept any input which has been entered by the user. And to do that, we can use a state variable that comes from the config struct we defined before. I'm going to create a mutable reference to self.config.api key. Now the field API key is not defined, so let's go back to our headlines config structure, and I'm going to add an API key field here, and this is going to be a string. Let's also update the initialization of the string. This is going to be an empty string to start with, and we have an error here. And notice that we already have a default initializer for headlines config, so we don't need the new method now. So I'm going to delete this whole impl block, and there is another error. So let's go back to the error, and notice the text edit single line method needs a mutable reference, but since self is not borrowed as mutable, you cannot create a mutable reference out of an immutable reference in Rust. So to fix that, we're going to have to pass self as mutable, and this should work. So with the text input added, we can use it to enter the API key. Later, we'll use the text input handle to the edit text widget to attach event handler so that we can collect the API key and save it using confy. But before that, let's also add a bit of context so that the user knows where to get the API key from. I'm going to quickly add a help text, and with that, let's try to run this again. And hey, we now have the text input field within the configuration window, and we can type things here, which will be taken up as the API key. And just to make sure that this is actually being stored in self.config.api key field, let's add a log line and see if you're able to capture the input. So I'm going to do tracing error, and we'll use the format string and try to print the API key. So let's run that, and notice that we are already seeing a lot of log lines, and the moment we try typing in the text here, you can see it is updating in real time. So it's important to also note the fact that in egui, the update method or the render loop renders many times in a second. In egui, by default, it is around 60 FPS. So that's that. So then let's try to attach an event handler for capturing the entered API key. Right now, if I press enter, this doesn't really do much since we don't have an input handler for the text edit widget. So we're going to create an event handler, and we'll need to combine two events here. The first one is if the text input has lost focus and there has been an input where the event is a key press event for the key enter. If we have both of these conditions satisfied, we'll call the config creates store method, use the headlines as the name of the config, and then create a headlines config where we pass the dark mode as the current dark mode value. And for the API key, let's use the currently entered API key. And this expression is trying to create a new string by value, but it is a mutable reference. So in order to fix that, we can do toString, and we'll be able to store the newly created state object in confy. But this might return an error, so let's handle the case where we could have an error. So we can use the if-let pattern match expression. So I'm going to do if-let error, and we'll capture the error description here. And if there is an error, we'll then use tracing's error macro to log the failure of saving the app state, and then pass in the error description that we captured from here. And just to see if our API key is being set, we can simply log API key set as a string. So then let's try to run this again and see if our event handler conditional works. So I'm going to do cargo run. And if I try to type in a sequence of text and press enter, you can see the API key set log line. So we are now able to store the app state by using confy's store method and passing in a new headlines config object. We can confirm this by going to the config folder in case of Linux. So if I try to print the contents of config headlines.toml, you can see that we have the state object serialized in a toml file. But if you notice, even though we have our API key set now, the configuration window still stays at the top. And ideally, we want this window to go away and load our articles list. So either we would have the API key config window shown if the API key is not set, or else we should get a list of news articles widget being rendered in the app. So let's make this exclusive. Let's add a check so that we only render one of the UIs based on whether the API key is set or not. So we can use a simple Boolean flag here, and this is going to be per session. So I'm going to add a field called API key initialized, which is going to be a Boolean. Let's initialize this as false. And using this field, we can conditionally render either the render config window or the remaining widget in the app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to conditionally check if self.api key is not initialized. We'll do self.renderConfig, else we'll render the remaining of the UI. Now API key is private, so let's make it public and let's try to run this. And as expected, we're only seeing the API config window being rendered in the app. So this is the ideal behavior we want. And additionally, if the user enters their API key and presses enter, the config window should go away and it should render this part of the UI, which is the list of articles. So let's add that behavior. We can go to the event handler for the API key text input. And right after we save the news app state, we'll also set the API key initialized field to true. And with that change, pressing enter on the API key should render our list of articles. So then it's time to finally start integrating the news API crate so that we can render real news articles within render news cards method. So I'm going to add the news API crate in cargo.toml. And since this is a local crate, I'm going to provide its path. And then let's go back to main.rs and we'll create a helper function called fetch news. So within fetch news, let's initialize the news API instance with the new function. We'll pass in the API key and then we'll call fetch, and this returns a result. So let's match on the OK variant of the result. We'll capture it as a response, and then using response, we'll grab the list of articles. We can then iterate over the list of articles and map each element as a news card data instance. For the title, we'll grab the title. For the URL, we do the same. For the description, we'll use the desc method. And this is an optional. So in case the value of description is a none, we can use the unwrap or method to compute a dummy description. So I'm going to put 3 dots here and let's convert that to a string. And notice we still have an error because the underlying type returned by the description function is a reference to a string. So there needs to be another step where we map the internal value to a new copy of the string, and this should work. So we are now fetching the actual data from the top headlines endpoint and converting all of them into news card data. But we need a way to update the articles field in headlines with the data that we have received in fetch news. And we also need to call this method the moment the app starts. And a good place to call this function is in the setup method. So let's call fetch news here. And we're going to pass the API key from the config object. And let's make it a reference. And to update the articles field in headlines, let's also pass a mutable reference to the self.articles field. And let's update the fetch news param. And this is going to be an mute of vector of news card data. And then let's update the code to also push the news instance that we created before. It looks like we have an error. And this error is because there is a name clash happening. So we have articles here and we also have articles being redefined here. So this articles is being shadowed by the variable created on line number 9. So I'm going to rename this to something else. Let's call it response articles. Let's update the usage as well. And this should work. So then let's try to run this and see if we are able to fetch the news data. And looks like even though we have already set up the API key, this window doesn't go away. Ideally, we want the config window to go away if the API key has been set. So let's fix that. I'm going to go back to headlines and the place where we instantiate the API key initialized field. This should now be changed to check if the API key has some value instead of being false all the time. So what we can do is we can do config.api key and we can check if the value is not empty. And we have an error from the compilers saying that the config instance is already used as a value for the headlines instance. So we cannot use this. So we can do two things. Either we can create a copy of this Boolean value before we assign the config to headlines, or we can change the order of field initialization, which would remove the error in a simple manner. So let's try to run this and we should see the config window go away. And that works. But if you notice the first few seconds of the app start, where we had a couple of seconds of black screen, that was the point where the app was lagging and trying to make network request to news API. And if I scroll down, you will see we have the news articles from the top headlines endpoint. So this works, but we have a lag and we also have these dummy list of articles that we should remove. So let's fix the lag issue and let's also remove the dummy list of articles. So I'm going to simply remove this line and we should no longer see dummy news articles. And let's update this to just be an empty vec since we're going to initialize this as part of fetch news method. So let's run this again and notice the lag again. And after a few seconds, we should see the real news articles. So our app is pretty much functional here. We can click on the links and this will open up in the browser, but we still have that initial blank screen and quite a bit of lag during the initial startup. So let's fix that. And this is the part where we get to use Rust threads and channels. So let's close that. I'm going to go back to main.rs. The reason we have an initial lag in the app is because by making a blocking network request in the main UI thread, we're blocking egui from rendering anything on the screen. So only after the fetch news function returns, we are then able to see the screen render. To do this in a better way, we'll need a way to offload the fetching of articles into a separate thread. So what we can do is we can create a thread here. We can spawn a thread from the std thread module. We'll use the spawn function, and this takes in a closure. It's an empty closure with no params. And within the body, we'll then move our fetch method from news API to fetch the news articles. Now we have an error here. And it says something that the static lifetime is required on articles and API key. And this error message can be a bit confusing if you're new to Rust. We'll have a series on the basics of Rust where we'll go over lifetimes in detail and everything will make sense after that. But just to give you a brief overview, think of the text static as a validity tag for reference types, which denotes that the reference lives for the whole lifetime of the program. To be specific, the value being referenced must live in the data section of the binary for us to be able to create a static reference out of it. But that is clearly not the case with API key and articles here, since they are created back in main. So if I go back to the call side, you'll see that the fetch news is called from the setup method, and setup is implemented on headlines, and headlines is initialized back in main. And because threads can outlive their parent thread, for instance, if they are launched as daemon threads, so that's why the compiler is unhappy about that. So an obvious fix for the lifetime issues in Rust is to create a copy of the type. We can do that for the API key. That's going to be simple. So I'm going to do API key.clone, and we have one error down. But copying won't work for articles here, since we would end up not modifying the original article fields in headline, but instead we'll be making changes to the local copy of articles. So another solution is to wrap articles in a mutex and share the variable within this thread. But this would involve making significant changes in the type definition of headlines. So the third alternative approach is to use Rust channels, which has a much nicer API. Rust channels underneath are basically thread safe queues, but they provide us with two handles to the queue. One is called the sender instance and the other is called the receiver. So the usual pattern of using channels is that you can pass the sender to as many threads as you want, and for the receiver you can use that to receive messages from n number of threads. So we're going to use the exact pattern here. So I'm going to create a channel here, and calling channel will return us a tuple of two elements. The first is called the sender half of the channel, and the second is called the receiver half of the channel. We're going to call the sender newsTX and the receiver newsRx. TX and RX are just naming conventions that is quite common in Rust projects using channels. So with the sender and receiver created, we can then use the sender side within the thread, and instead of pushing the news in articles, we'll do newsTX.send, and we're going to send the news article. And notice that we have an error here, and this error means that the closure is trying to take the sender as a reference, but instead we are okay to pass newsTX as a value. So we can explicitly ask the closure to take ownership of any values that gets used within the closure with the move keyword. And looks like there's still an error for the API key that we have. So instead of calling clone, we should be calling the toString method. We should be calling the toString method here, and the error should go away. And this needs a reference. Let's make it a reference here, and this should fix all of our errors. I'm going to remove this. Now calling send might give us an error, so it returns result type in case the receiver side of the handle is deallocated or dropped. So let's check for any errors that we might possibly get from sending the news article, and let's log this using tracing's error macro. Let's put a message. So that's our sender side of things done, but it is of no use if we can't read data from the receiver side. So what we'll have to do is we'll need to attach the receiver side as an instance of headlines so that we can use that in the update method to read news articles from it. So we'll be creating a field called newsRx on headlines, and we will assign that to the newsRx we have created here. Let's add a field in headlines, and this is going to be a newsRx, and it is of type receiver, and the received type is going to be news card data. Let's go back. Now we're trying to use self here, but this function doesn't have access to self. So let's move all of this inside setup, and let's remove the fetch news function and this as well. This will then become self.config.api key, and let's fix the name of the field, and we should be able to assign the value to newsRx. Now this is going to be an optional type since we won't have an Rx created right at the initialization. It is only going to be assigned the moment we spawn a child thread, and that will happen only in the setup method. So that's that. And let's also update the initialization of the headlines instance in new with the newsRx, since we won't have an instance of the receiver, so we can initialize that with none to start with. So with that change, our app should be sending news articles on a channel, and the only thing now left is to receive our messages back in the update method. So to receive the articles sent from this child thread back in update, let's create a method called self.reload articles, and this is going to be a method on headlines. Within this method, we're going to try to receive the news articles from the newsRx receiver end. So I'm going to do self.newsRx, and we're going to match if we have a newsRx instance, and we're going to match again on the inner type, and we are going to call try receive on it. Now the try receive method is a non-blocking call, which means that in case there isn't anything on the channel, it will not block the thread, but instead will return from the call. So calling try receive can give us either an OK value with our news data, and if it is a news data that we have received, we will then push the news card data into self.articles. Otherwise, if it's an error, we'll just log this error using tracing's warn API. And we have another error. We simply need to prefix this with ampersand, and this should fix that. So let's try to run this now and see if we are able to fetch the news articles. And this already looks a lot close to what we had aimed for. But if you notice a little weird behavior there, that if I try to run this app again, notice that we're not seeing anything being rendered yet. But the moment I move the cursor to the screen, you can see that it will start to populate the list of articles. And this happens because egui by default tries to be as efficient as possible in terms of resource consumption. So it will only render the widget state as long as it sees any activity on the app. But if you don't want that behavior, we can explicitly ask egui to render the article as soon as there is any change in the state. So let's do that. So right before we do any rendering of the widget, we can use the context object and call the request paint method. And what this will do is, regardless of any input or widget update that has happened, egui will try to render reframe as needed. So if we run this now, we'll see that our app loads immediately without us having to move the cursor on the screen. So we're almost done here, but there is one edge case that we haven't accounted for. Remember that our app loads and tries to read the config file and then proceeds to fetch the articles. Now, if someone were to launch this app for the first time, they would not be having the API keys set and our app will break. So let's simulate that case. I'm going to delete the headlines config and I'm going to run our app again. And as expected, we will see the API config window. So let's enter our API key and press enter. And notice that the articles are not being loaded in this case. And that's because by the time the render config window appears, the thread has already spawned and was trying to fetch the news articles with an empty API key, since it starts as an empty string. And so it fails, and then the thread exits immediately. So to fix that, we'll need to make the thread wait and be aware of quote unquote the first time launch state of the app. And we can do that by checking for the API key within the thread. So if the API key is not empty, we'll call a helper function called fetch news. To this, we will pass the API key and a mutable reference to the newsTX sender. This method isn't created, so let's create that. I'm going to name this fetch news. Let's pass the API key as a reference to a string. And this is also going to be a mutable reference. And this is not mutable, so let's make this mutable. So if the API key is not empty, we go the usual path of fetching the news articles. Otherwise, we will go into a loop. And here we'll try to wait for a message from the update method. And for that, let's create a new channel here. And this is going to be a sync channel with a size of 1, since we're just going to be using it as a signaling mechanism. So this also returns us a sender and receiver pair. I'm going to name this apptx and the other one as apprx. And for the sync channel, the type of the message that we're going to send is going to be a message enum. So let's define that. I'm going to create an enum called message, and I'm going to add a variant called API key set, and this is going to carry a string which will be the API key. And since we're going to be sending this message from the update method, so let's add a field in the headlines struct. Let's call it apptx, and this is also going to be an option, and it is going to be a sync sender type, and it will be sending data of type message. And let's update the initialization for apptx as none. So then, using the apptx sender, the moment we press the enter key on the API config window, we will also send a message on the apptx channel. So we'll check if we have the apptx, and if there is a sender, we will then send the message, which will be of type API key, and this is going to contain the newly set API key as a string. So now that we are signaling the event of setting the API key in the config window, we can then act on this message in the else block here within the loop. So what we can do here is we can match on apprx and call receive on it. And if we receive an OK message of type API key set with the API key, we will then call fetch news with the API key and the sender. And let's make the message type public so we can use it. And for this, let's pass our reference. And there is an error on the receive method call for not covering the error variant. So let's catch the error variant as well. And let's log the error. And we have one more error. So let's fix that. And this should work now. And there is one small part that we need to add, which is to assign the aptx to the aptx that we have created here. So then I'm going to remove the headlines config and we're going to start fresh. I'm going to do cargo run and let's enter the API key. And this time we should see the articles being rendered on the screen. So we're pretty much done here, and I'm going to leave the implementation for the refresh button here as an exercise for you, as it will help me understand that you're able to follow what I explain. So feel free to fork the repository and implement the refresh button, and you can share your solutions in the comments with the link to your repo. So with that, we have come to the end of this video, and I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.